Hello everyone and welcome to another endgame episode with Coach B and masteryourchess.com. This video goes over the same position that was covered in the Tailhook Defense, and it's only going to go over the correct play for this position. It's intended for review of the material only. If you haven't watched and mastered the original video that goes over why other lines don't work, I encourage you to watch that longer video first and practice those positions against the computer. That video is important to fully understand the position. In this video, I will not offer much explanation, just a few comments at the critical moments of the position. Again, this is just intended for review of that material. So in this position with black to move, white's goal is to achieve a draw by sacrificing his rook for the pawn that will promote, while the king will take the backward pawn. But this is a more complicated position, as the white king has a little bit of a difficulty attacking the backward pawn. So here with black to move, there's two main variations. He could move the pawn to g3 or move the other pawn to h4. So let's go over the easier line first. After pawn to h4, rook to g7 check, king to f4, rook f7 check, king to g3, king to g7, h3, king to g6. If the pawn moves to h2, rook to h7, king to g2, king to g7, g3, and after king to g4, this is a drawn position. If the pawn will promote, the rook will simply take it, and after the king takes the rook, the other king will take the pawn. And coming back, after king to f2, rook to h3. If king to g1, rook will take on g3, king to f2, rook to h3, and now the rook will simply be able to take the other pawn, and the game will be drawn. And coming back, black cannot push the pawn to g2 here, because after rook takes h3, the pawn on the g file is pinned to the king, and then white will be able to capture that pawn as well, reaching a draw. And coming back, if instead of moving the pawn to h2, if king g2 is played instead, after king to g5, black again has two options. If he moves the pawn to h2, well, the white rook will simply come behind it to prevent it from promoting, and since the white king is already attacking the backward pawn, the draw should be easy from here. After g3 and king to g4, the same drawing position has been reached, where the rook will sacrifice for the pawn that will promote and the king will take the backward pawn. And coming back, if instead of moving the pawn to h2, black tries pawn to g3 here, after king to g4, pawn to h2, rook to h7, the same drawing position has been reached. Coming back to the very beginning, a better play for black here would be moving the pawn to g3, as it's going to be a lot more challenging for white to reach a draw in this case. After this, the correct play will be king to e7. If king to f4 is played here, the drawing position will be reached easier. After rook to f7 check, king to g4, rook to g7 check, the king could go either to f3 or h3. If king goes to h3, king to f6, g2, rook to g5, an important move, as the white king is trying to go after the backward pawn. Coming back, white doesn't want to step in front of the rook, as the pawn can promote with the check. So after rook to g5, pawn to h4, king to g6, king to h2, king to h5, pawn to h3, king to h4, the same drawing position has been reached, where the rook will sacrifice for the pawn that will promote, and then the white king will take the backward pawn. And coming back, we looked at king to h3. If king to f3 is played instead, here white can play king to f6. And now there's two tries again for black, either moving the pawn to h4 or moving the pawn to g2. If the pawn moves to g2, the rook here could simply capture that pawn. After king takes the rook, king to g5, that pawn will not be able to be defended, so the white king will simply take it. And coming back, better play here will be pawn to h4. After this, white will reply with king to g5, pawn to h3, king to h4. Now white is able to achieve a draw. After pawn to h3, the rook could take the pawn on g3 with check, and after the king moves away, the rook will go behind the pawn and then be able to sacrifice for the other pawn. Coming back, I do want to mention that moving the pawn to g2 does not work, as the king could take the pawn on h3, and now white will be able to win this game. And coming back from the very beginning, after g3, king to e7, we looked at the king going to f4. Better play for black would be here, moving the pawn to h4. After this, king to e6, king to g4. And now this is a critical moment, as the white king will not be able to go towards the backward pawn. Rook to g7 is needed. After king to f3, another check is needed here. What white wants to do is get the black king in front of the pawn that is more advanced, giving white an extra tempo to be able to attack the backward pawn. So after rook to f7 check, after king to g2, here white gains a tempo as the more advanced pawn cannot move forward, which gives white enough time to bring the king to f5. After h3, king to g4, pawn to h2, rook to h7, And now the drawing position has been reached. We've seen this: if the pawn promotes, the rook will sacrifice and the white king will simply take the other pawn. And coming back, if king to f2, king to f4, pawn to g2, rook can take on h2, pinning the g pawn and then later capturing it. And coming back after the check on the f file, if the black king will not step in front of the more advanced pawn but it will move to e3 instead, well, here white will be able to move the rook to g7 again. Moving the king to f3, white will simply check again and repeat the position. So eventually black will have to try something different. After king to f2, rook to f7 check. Again, here the black king doesn't want to go back to e3, repeating the position, so he's going to eventually step on the g file. Well, now he is in front of the more advanced pawn, giving white the tempo that he needs. So after the rook to h7, he moves the pawn to g2. He's simply going to take the pawn on h4. After king to f1, the rook will go behind the pawn and be able to win it. Coming back, if the pawn will move to h3 instead, well, this doesn't help either, because the rook will simply take the pawn on h3 after g2. The same position has been reached where the rook will sacrifice for the pawn on g2. Alright, thank you so much for watching this video. I encourage you to visit my website masteryourchess.com to practice this position against the computer. Make sure that you still remember this lesson and you fully comprehend it. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.